At exactly midnight on her 21st birthday, Elizabeth Foster was handed a trash bag of her clothes and a one-way bus ticket. Her billionaire father told her she was legally a stranger, dead to him, but a condemned $1 Tollhouse was about to hand her the ultimate, devastating revenge. The rain in Litchfield, Connecticut, didn't just fall. It felt like it was being thrown. It was a bitter, biting November night when the heavy oak doors of the Foster estate slammed shut behind Elizabeth. She stood on the gravel driveway, the cold seeping through the thin soles of her sneakers, staring up at the massive illuminated windows of her childhood home. In her arms, she held a black plastic trash bag. Inside were 3 pairs of jeans, a few sweaters, and a framed photograph of her late mother. That was it. That was the entirety of her inheritance. Her father, Henry Foster, CEO of a massive Northeast real estate conglomerate, had planned this with surgical precision. For years, he had been legally maneuvering to drain the trust fund Elizabeth's mother had left her. The final stipulation of the trust stated that Elizabeth would gain control of the remaining capital on her 21st birthday, unless she formally renounced it. When Henry presented her with the renunciation papers, expecting her to blindly sign them, as she had always signed his documents, Elizabeth finally read the fine print. She refused. Henry's retaliation was swift and absolute. He claimed she was unstable, cut off her credit cards, seized her car, and had his security physically escort her off the property. As she was pushed out the door, her stepmother Cynthia stood in the foyer, sipping a martini, offering a perfectly glossed, razor-thin smile. "Happy birthday, Abby," Cynthia had purred. "Welcome to the real world." Elizabeth spent her first night of adulthood shivering in a bus station, clutching her trash bag. She had exactly $412 in a secret, separate checking account she had opened in high school. It was nowhere near enough for first and last month's rent anywhere in the state. She was practically a ghost, erased by a man whose wealth could rewrite reality. For 3 days, Elizabeth survived on stale bagels and slept in the back booth of an all-night diner run by a gruff but observant man named Hank Sullivan. It was Hank who handed her the local classifieds, tapping a grease-stained finger against a tiny, uncelebrated box in the legal notices section. Property for municipal auction. 1,794 Stone Tollhouse Route, 119. Minimum bid $1. Purchaser assumes all structural liability and code compliance within 90 days. Failure to comply results in demolition at owner's expense. It was a joke, a municipal trap. The local government wanted to clear a dangerous, rotting historical structure off the tax rolls, but didn't want to pay the $50,000 demolition and hazmat fees. They were looking for a sucker. Elizabeth was beyond being a sucker. She was desperate. The next morning, she walked into the Litchfield County Clerk's office. The clerk, a bespectacled woman named Mildred Higgins, peered over the rim of her glasses at the exhausted, damp 21-year-old girl standing at her counter. "Honey, you don't want this property," Mildred warned, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "The roof is caved in on the west side. Black mold. The foundation is shifting. It's an 18th century tomb. The town just wants a scapegoat to foot the bulldozer bill." "I have no place to go," Elizabeth said, her voice eerily calm. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled, damp $1 bill, and smoothed it out on the counter. "I'll take it." The paperwork took 2 hours. When Elizabeth signed the final deed, her hand shook. She was now a homeowner. She owned a disaster. The Tollhouse sat in a dense, forgotten stretch of woods off the old turnpike. It was a grim, squat structure made of uneven fieldstone, blanketed in invasive ivy, that seemed to be the only thing holding the walls together. The windows were long gone, boarded up with rotting plywood. The front door was chained shut. When Elizabeth snapped the rusted padlock with a pair of bolt cutters she'd bought at the hardware store, the door creaked open, exhaling a breath of stagnant, freezing air. The inside was a nightmare. The floorboards were spongy with rot, animal droppings littered the corners, and the smell of mildew was thick enough to taste. In the center of the main room stood a massive, towering stone fireplace, its chimney stretching up through the collapsed ceiling. Elizabeth dropped her trash bag on the only solid piece of floor she could find. She sank to her knees, the sheer impossibility of her situation crashing down on her. She had $1 to her name. She had 90 days to bring an 18th century ruin up to modern building codes, or the town would seize it, bulldoze it, and sue her for the demolition costs. She screamed. She screamed until her throat was raw, the sound bouncing off the cold stone walls, swallowed by the surrounding forest. But when the echo faded, the silence that followed wasn't the oppressive silence of her father's mansion. It was the silence of something that belonged entirely to her. She wiped her face, stood up, and pulled a flashlight and a heavy pair of work gloves from her bag. "Okay," she whispered to the empty room. "Let's get to work." The first 40 days were a lesson in brutal, back-breaking survival. Elizabeth struck a deal with Hank at the diner. She would work the graveyard shift scrubbing floors and prepping the kitchen in exchange for minimum wage and all the expired food she could carry away. Every dollar she earned went to heavy-duty tarps, concrete mix, and second-hand tools. She learned masonry from library books, mixing mortar in a plastic bucket by the light of a kerosene lantern. She slept in a pop-up tent inside the living room to keep the biting drafts out, waking up with frost on her eyelashes. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, were now callous, cracked, and permanently stained with dirt and limestone. But the real threat wasn't the cold. It was Thomas Croft. Croft was the county building inspector, a man whose tailored suits and shiny luxury sedan looked wildly out of place on the muddy rut of Elizabeth's driveway. He showed up on day 45 with a clipboard and a smirk that reminded Elizabeth entirely too much of her stepmother. "You're fighting a losing battle, little girl," Croft sneered, kicking a piece of rotting timber with his polished loafer. "This place is a structural death trap. I'm pulling your occupancy permit. I'll give you a week to vacate before I bring the excavators in." "I have 90 days," Elizabeth fired back, standing in his path. "The contract says 90 days to stabilize the primary structure. The roof is tarped, and the foundation beams are braced. The central chimney is severely compromised." Croft shot back, pointing his pen at the massive stone hearth. "It's leaning 2 degrees to the east. The mortar is dust. If that falls, it crushes the house. Code section 402. Fix it, or I condemn the property next Friday." As Croft drove away, his tires spinning in the mud, Elizabeth felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. He was right. The chimney was the heart of the house, and the massive stones above the mantel were precariously loose. She didn't have the thousands of dollars required to hire a professional mason to rebuild a 2-story stone chimney. And then the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The local radio called it a once-in-a-decade nor'easter. It hit Litchfield with ferocious speed. By nightfall, 2 feet of snow had blanketed the woods, and the temperature plummeted to 9 degrees. The wind howled through the tarps on the roof, tearing at the plastic sheathing on the windows. Inside her tent, Elizabeth was freezing to death. Her breath plumed in the dark. She knew that if she didn't get a fire going, she wouldn't survive the night. But lighting a fire in the compromised hearth was suicide. The flue was blocked by debris, and the loose stones could collapse from the heat expansion. Desperation took over. Shivering violently, Elizabeth grabbed a heavy iron crowbar. If she could just pry out the loose stones at the throat of the chimney, she could clear the blockage and let the smoke vent safely. She stood before the massive fireplace. The keystone above the mantel, a large, jagged piece of dark granite, was jutting out unnaturally. She jammed the flat edge of the crowbar into the crumbling mortar beside it and threw her entire body weight against the iron bar. Nothing. She screamed in frustration, her muscles burning, and threw her weight into it again. Crack! The century-old mortar gave way with a puff of grey dust. Elizabeth dropped the crowbar and grabbed the sides of the heavy stone, wiggling it back and forth. It weighed at least 50 pounds, grating against the surrounding rocks. With one final desperate heave, she pulled the stone free and let it crash to the floorboards. She stumbled back, gasping for air. When the dust settled, she aimed her flashlight into the hole left by the stone. She expected to see the blackened, soot-stained interior of the chimney flue. Instead, she saw dull, grey metal. Elizabeth froze. She stepped closer, shining the beam directly into the cavity. It wasn't a flue. It was a secret compartment, carefully carved out of the surrounding masonry and lined with thick sheets of lead to protect it from the heat of the fire. Her heart hammering against her ribs, Elizabeth reached her trembling cut hands into the dark cavity. Her fingers brushed against something heavy, wrapped in layers of brittle oiled canvas. It took all her remaining strength to drag the bundle out of the cavity and onto the floor. The oilcloth was stiff and coated in decades of dust. Her breath catching in her throat, Elizabeth peeled back the heavy canvas. Inside sat a heavy rectangular iron lockbox. It was antique, the kind of strong box used on stagecoaches in the 1800s. The brass lock on the front was green with age, but it had already been forced open long ago, the clasp hanging loosely. Elizabeth lifted the heavy iron lid. The smell of old paper, dried wax, and something metallic wafted up. The box wasn't filled with gold coins or jewelry. It was packed to the brim with thick, bound stacks of paper and several heavy leather journals. She picked up the top bundle. It was wrapped in twine. She slid one of the slips of paper out. It was currency. But not any currency Elizabeth had ever seen. It was larger than a modern dollar bill, intricately engraved with the words, United States Note. $1,000 scrolled across the top. The date in the corner read 1890, and there wasn't just one. There were dozens of them. Elizabeth dropped the bill, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the flashlight. She reached deeper into the box and pulled out the largest of the leather journals. The cover was cracked, the initials NF stamped into the leather in faded gold leaf. She flipped it open to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping, and written in dark iron gall ink. October 14th, 1898. If this box is found, then I am dead, and the sins of my family have finally caught up with the earth. My name is Nathaniel Foster, and the empire I have built, the wealth my descendants now enjoy, is entirely stolen. Elizabeth's blood ran ice cold. Nathaniel Foster, her great-great-grandfather, the patriarch of the Foster real estate empire, the man whose portrait hung in her father's study, revered as a titan of industry. She sat cross-legged on the freezing floor, the storm raging outside, completely forgotten. She turned the fragile page. The journal wasn't just a diary. It was a meticulous, mathematically precise ledger of fraud. Page after page detailed how Nathaniel Foster, acting as the county treasurer in the late 1800s, had systematically forged land deeds foreclosed on innocent farmers and embezzled municipal funds to purchase the very land that now made up downtown Litchfield and the surrounding commercial districts. But the real shock came on page 42. Nathaniel hadn't just stolen from strangers. He had documented a massive secret trust, a secondary pool of wealth hidden in bearer bonds and real estate holding companies. And according to the final entry signed and sealed with a notary stamp, this hidden empire was legally willed not to the eldest sons of the Foster line, but to the first female heir to reach the age of 21. Elizabeth stared at the words, her mind spinning. Her father hadn't kicked her out just out of spite or because of her mother's trust. Henry Foster had known about this clause. He had known that somewhere the original proof of the Foster inheritance existed, and if Elizabeth ever found out, she wouldn't just own her mother's money, she would legally own the entire Foster empire. She looked at the stacks of pristine $18,000-$90,000 notes. A quick mental calculation told her there was at least $1 million in antique face value alone. To a collector, the uncirculated grand watermelon notes were worth tens of millions. But the money in the box was nothing compared to the power of the ledger. Elizabeth looked up at the crumbling stone walls of the $1 Tollhouse. Her father had thrown her away like garbage, stripping her of everything, leaving her to freeze in a forgotten ruin. He thought he had buried her. He didn't realize he had buried her with the very weapon that could destroy him. A slow, dangerous smile crept across Elizabeth's face. The terrified, shivering girl who had been crying in the dark was gone. In her place was a woman who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. "Well, Dad," Elizabeth whispered, closing the heavy iron ledger. "Looks like I'm moving back in." When dawn broke, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a blindingly bright, silent world of white. Elizabeth didn't sleep. She spent the remaining hours of the night meticulously photographing every page of the ledger with her cracked smartphone and packing the uncirculated 1890 notes into waterproof bags. She needed an ally, and she knew exactly one person in Litchfield who wouldn't sell her out. She hiked 3 miles through the snowdrifts to the diner. Hank Sullivan was wiping down the counter when she pushed through the doors looking like a frost-bitten ghost, clutching her backpack. "Abby, for the love of God," Hank said, dropping his rag. "I tried driving out to the turnpike last night, but the roads were impassable. I thought you were dead." "I need your help, Hank," Elizabeth said, her voice raspy but steady. She slid into a booth and unzipped her bag. "And I need you to swear you won't tell a soul what I'm about to show you." Hank poured 2 cups of black coffee, sat across from her, and nodded. Elizabeth reached into the bag and pulled out a single bill, one of the $18,090,000 grand watermelon notes. She slid it across the Formica table. Hank, who collected antique coins and wartime memorabilia, stared at it as if it were a live grenade. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his eyes wide. "Abby, if this is real, there are only a handful of these left in the world. Last one went at auction for over $3 million. "I have 30 of them," she replied flatly, "and I need to liquidate one immediately without my father finding out." Hank didn't ask questions. He made a phone call to a discreet numismatic appraiser he knew in Manhattan, a man named Arthur Pendleton. By noon, Hank had driven Elizabeth to the city. Pendleton took one look at the pristine condition of the note under his loupe, verified the serial numbers, and nearly fainted. He offered her an immediate private sale advance of $1.5 million wired to a newly established secure offshore account by the end of the business day. The shivering, penniless girl who had been thrown out in the rain was gone. Elizabeth walked out of the appraiser's office a millionaire. But she knew the cash was just ammunition. The ledger was the gun. She had less than 5 days before Thomas Croft, the corrupt building inspector, arrived to condemn the Tollhouse. Elizabeth didn't just hire a contractor. She hired the most expensive, aggressive historical restoration firm in New England. She paid triple their standard rate for priority hazard pay labor. For the next 4 days, the forgotten Tollhouse swarmed with structural engineers, master masons, and electricians. They poured a reinforced concrete sub-foundation, rebuilt the massive stone chimney to flawless modern safety codes, and installed a heavy slate roof. On Friday morning, the muddy rut of a driveway rumbled with the sound of heavy machinery. Thomas Croft stepped out of his luxury sedan, flanked by 2 massive yellow bulldozers. He wore a smug, victorious grin, carrying a bright red condemned sign. Elizabeth was waiting for him on the front porch. She was holding a steaming mug of tea, wearing a tailored wool coat that cost more than Croft's car. "Time's up, little girl," Croft barked, signaling the bulldozer operators to idle their engines. "You didn't fix the chimney. I'm taking the property." Elizabeth calmly walked down the newly repaired stone steps. She handed Croft a thick manila folder. "What is this?" he scoffed. "Certificates of structural compliance, signed by 3 independent state engineers," Elizabeth said, her tone dripping with ice. "A passing grade on the updated foundation, and a certified historical preservation injunction. This building is now a protected landmark. If your bulldozers touch so much as a blade of grass on this property, my lawyers will have you in federal court by lunch." Croft's face drained of color as he flipped through the documents. The architectural seals were undeniable. The masonry was perfect. "How?" Croft stammered, his eyes darting from the reinforced roof to her designer coat. "Where did you get the money for this? Henry said you were broke." "Tell my father." Elizabeth leaned in close, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "that the Tollhouse was the best investment I ever made." Croft scrambled back into his sedan and sped off the bulldozers, awkwardly reversing down the road behind him. Less than an hour later, Henry Foster received the panicked phone call. He sat in his corner office, staring at the Litchfield skyline, a skyline his family supposedly built. A cold sweat broke out on his neck. He had chosen the Tollhouse specifically because it was impossible to save. He wanted her broken, desperate, and begging to sign the renunciation papers to survive. Instead, she had defeated him. And if she had restored the chimney... Henry's blood ran cold. The legend of Nathaniel Foster's lockbox was a dark family secret passed down from father to son. Henry had spent millions secretly excavating old Foster properties, trying to find the missing ledger. He never imagined his ancestor had hidden it in the one place no Foster would ever look, a worthless $1 ruin on the edge of town. Panic set in. Henry picked up his phone and dialed his head of security. "Find my daughter. Now." Elizabeth wasn't hiding. She was preparing for war. She had taken her evidence to Beatrice Montgomery, a ruthless, legendary corporate litigator in Boston. Beatrice spent 3 sleepless nights poring over Nathaniel Foster's ledger, cross-referencing the 1898 bearer bonds and the holding company documents with modern SEC filings. When Beatrice finally called Elizabeth into her glass-walled office, the lawyer was practically vibrating with excitement. "It's an ironclad kill shot," Beatrice said, slapping the heavy file onto her desk. "Nathaniel Foster created a shadow corporation, Aegis Holdings. He transferred 51% of the voting shares of the main Foster empire into Aegis to protect it from his creditors. He willed Aegis exclusively to the first female heir, to reach 21, bypassing the patriarchal line, because he blamed his sons for his impending ruin." "And my father knew," Elizabeth said quietly. "Of course he knew," Beatrice replied. "The trust activation date was your 21st birthday. If you had signed those renunciation papers your father shoved in your face, you would have legally surrendered your claim to Aegis Holdings. Because you didn't, and because you are now 21, You don't just own half his money, Elizabeth. You own the company. You are his boss." The timing couldn't have been more poetic. That Saturday night was the Foster Centennial Gala, a lavish black tie event hosted at the country club to celebrate 100 years of Foster real estate. The governor was there. The mayor was there. Every major investor in the Northeast was sipping champagne on Henry Foster's dime. At 9 p.m., Henry stepped up to the crystal podium in the main ballroom. Cynthia stood beside him, draped in a fortune of diamonds, beaming for the flashing cameras. For a century, the Foster name has been synonymous with integrity, growth, and community. Henry boomed into the microphone, his charismatic smile masking the terror gnawing at his stomach. "We built this city from the ground up, and we did it the right way." The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly slammed open. The loud crack echoed over the sound system, silencing the room. Every head turned. Elizabeth walked in. She wore a floor-length, midnight blue silk gown that commanded the room. Her posture was flawless, her gaze fixed entirely on the man at the podium. Flanking her were Beatrice Montgomery and 3 federal marshals in dark suits. Whispers erupted across the ballroom. Everyone knew the rumor that Henry had institutionalized his unstable daughter. Yet here she was, looking like royalty. Henry gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "Security!" He barked into the microphone. "Remove her. She's not on the guest list." "Actually, Henry, I own the venue." Elizabeth projected her voice, ringing clear and authoritative across the silent crowd. She didn't need a microphone. She walked straight down the center aisle, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. Cynthia looked like she was going to be sick. "You're out of your mind," Henry hissed, stepping down from the stage to block her path, trying to keep his voice low. "I will have you arrested for trespassing." "Trespassing on my own property." Elizabeth smiled a cold, sharp expression. She snapped her fingers. Beatrice stepped forward and handed Henry a thick stack of legal documents. "Henry Foster," Beatrice said loudly, ensuring the front row of investors heard every word. "You are hereby served with an emergency federal injunction. Ownership of 51% of Foster Real Estate has legally reverted to Aegis Holdings, of which Elizabeth Foster is the sole beneficiary and CEO." "This is a forgery. It's a lie," Henry shouted, throwing the papers onto the floor. "The original 1898 ledger, penned by your grandfather, is currently sitting in a federal evidence vault," Elizabeth said smoothly. "It details exactly how this company was built on embezzled municipal funds and stolen farmland. It also details the Aegis Trust, the trust you tried to force me to blindly renounce on my birthday." The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of gasps and murmurs. The investors in the front row were already pulling out their phones, frantically texting their brokers. "You threw me out in the freezing rain with a trash bag, Dad." Elizabeth continued stepping closer, so only he could hear the final blow. "You thought you broke me, but all you did was hand me the deed to the very place where our family's darkest secrets were buried. You sent me to the Tollhouse." Henry staggered back as if he had been physically struck. The blood drained from his face. He looked at the federal marshals, then at the furious, panicked faces of his board members. He had nothing left. His empire was built on a lie, and the girl he had discarded was the one holding the match. "By the way," Elizabeth added, turning to her stepmother, who was trembling in her designer heels, "you have 24 hours to vacate the estate. Leave the keys on the counter. Welcome to the real world, Cynthia." Within 48 hours, Foster Real Estate was completely restructured. Henry was ousted by the board and immediately placed under federal investigation for decades of corporate fraud and trust tampering. He lost his mansion, his cars, and his freedom. Cynthia left him before the indictments were even unsealed. Elizabeth took control of the conglomerate. Her first act as CEO was establishing a massive community fund, returning millions to the descendants of the families Nathaniel Foster had ruined a century prior. She fired Thomas Croft and fully funded the town's Historical Preservation Society. She didn't move back into the sprawling, empty mansion. Instead, Elizabeth lived in the restored 1794 stone Tollhouse. The massive fireplace was now the warm, beating heart of a beautiful home, the stones radiating a comforting heat against the Connecticut winters. Every time she sat by the fire, looking at the seamless masonry where the lockbox used to be, she smiled. She had bought her revenge for exactly $1, and it was worth every penny. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge and hidden treasure, hit that like button right now. Have you ever found something hidden in an old house? Tell us about your craziest discoveries in the comments below. Don't forget to share this incredible real-life drama with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable stories of secrets, betrayal, and sweet justice. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.